There we go. So again, good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission and the Ephrata Cloister Associates, I want to welcome everyone here this evening. I'm Michael Showalter, the museum educator at Historic Ephrata Cloister, and it's really a pleasure to have you this evening. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Ephrata Cloister, the community was founded in 1732 as a religious refuge from the outside world. It was founded by the German immigrant Conrad Beissel, and by the mid-1750s, the community included about 80 celibate members and about 200 family members. The community became known for its art, music, architecture, publishing. And in about the 1740s, Brother Obed began a school for neighboring children. So his school eventually continued on into the mid-19th century, and the community built the Ephrata Academy building, one of the original buildings at the site. And that provides the inspiration for the broad title of our evening lecture series, the Virtual Ephrata Academy. This evening, we have with us Mike Emery, from the site administrator from Historic Cornwall Iron Furnace. The Historic Cornwall Iron Furnace, as Mike will be sharing with us, is really one of the amazing industrial architectural features surviving from mid-19th century America. Mike is the director of the site and a person who has worked at several other of the state museums throughout his career. He brings a vast knowledge of many different areas to this program this evening. So it's really my pleasure to have Mike share this history of the Cornwall Furnace with us this evening. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to him.
Thank you very much, Michael. I just want to thank you for allowing me to give a talk on the presentation of Cornwall Iron Furnace. I do have a prepared PowerPoint presentation. Mainly what we're going to talk about is significance of the Cornwall Mine, but also significance of the Cornwall Iron Furnace. We're also going to talk a little bit about some of the workers who are at Cornwall as well. So let me go ahead. I'll start my presentation. Okay, one moment. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
You can. Great, thank you very much. I wanted to make sure you'd be able to see that. So let's begin. So first, I just wanted to start off with the mission of the Cornwall Iron Furnace. Ours is a very simple mission, simply stated. The mission of the Cornwall Iron Furnace is to preserve, collect, and interpret the history of the sole surviving charcoal-fueled iron furnace in North America for the diverse people of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and for the visiting public. The Cornwall Iron Furnace is administered by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission and is actively supported by the Friends of the Cornwall Iron Furnace, which is a nonprofit community-based organization. So that's who we are. So we are located in Lebanon County. You can see where I've located that there on the map. This initially had been part of Lancaster County, later became part of Dauphin County, and then Lebanon County was created out of Dauphin County. So we're located just north of Lancaster in what some people would call southeastern Pennsylvania, some people call more central Pennsylvania, but solidly within the heart of the Pennsylvania Dutch settled region of Pennsylvania. I also want to just talk a little bit about common terms, because these are things that get thrown around quite a bit and sometimes get used interchangeably. And these are not interchangeable words. The words are furnace, forge, and foundry. So a furnace refers to a place that smelts ore and produces metal. A forge is one that casts, it converts cast iron into wrought iron. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and talk about that process. And a foundry typically converts ingots into cast finished products. So again, just keep those things in mind as we're doing the talk tonight. So the first part of the talk that I'd like to speak about is about the Cornwall Mine itself. So the Cornwall Mine operated from the late 1730s up until 1973. Its significance, the largest iron ore deposit in the eastern United States, and was the largest iron deposit in the United States until the Mesabi Range was discovered in the Minnesota area. Over its rather vast time period that it was in operation, it yielded 160 million tons of iron ore, as well as copper, gold, silver, and cobalt. And if you're interested more in some of those things, we have some wonderful talks on YouTube that were given by a volunteer of ours, also a volunteer of Ephrata, Mike Weber, on the mining. So I'm just going to touch upon this briefly tonight. If you have any other questions, you can see that in our other lectures. And if you know Mike, he has so much better information on this than I do. So Cornwall, as far as an iron ore deposit, was made up of 3 hills. And you can see on this 1873 map of the Cornwall Ore Bank that to the far right, you have Big Hill, which was really the earliest mined area of the Cornwall Ore Bank, Middle Hill, and also Grassy Hill. So it's between these 3 hills that 160 million tons of ore eventually come out of. Now, this is a photograph of people mining at Cornwall. And that's the other thing I wanted to tell you about. All of these photos that you're going to see, particularly the mining photos, these are not general mining photos. These are all at Cornwall. So this is one of the earliest photographs that we have of the mining operation. And most people, when they think of mine, they think of something underground, or they think of something that's on a very, very mechanical, very large scale. But in the 18th century and throughout a good portion of the 19th century, this is what mining at Cornwall looked like. You had men that are using pickaxes, shovels, and also they're using dump carts and mules in order to take iron ore out of it. So it's very much, hand work, hand labor. And again, through a good section of the history of mining, this is what mining looked like at Cornwall. Over time, steam power allowed for the use of locomotives and ore cars in the pit. You'll see in this photograph, while the men are still using kind of picks and shovels and bars over on the left-hand side, note the temporary tracks. Those are being used to load the iron ore into these small rail cars that are then taking the iron ore out of this open pit. Eventually, compressed air was used to help drill into the ore. The men in the foreground here are using a 2-man drill, and the men in the background, you can see all these men that are back here, are putting ore into wheelbarrows. And those wheelbarrows, they would go ahead and put planks directly out onto railroad cars, and they would then dump that into the cars. So over time, they're continuing to put new technology in to use at the mine. So this image is a very early image that we have of Big Hill. So this is looking kind of in the northern direction towards the city of Lebanon. So you'll note the miners in the middle of this photo. I'm going to put my cursor on the miners. That's these little specks that you can see here. Those are all men that are working on this terrace. You'll also notice all these different terraces here. At one time, there was a spiral railroad that ran the entire way around Big Hill, and they would go ahead and mine into these terraces, put ore into the railroad cars, and then be able to get that out. But also note all the other railroads or other rail lines that were being used in this. So, you know, rail and the use of railroads is something that's very important. One thing I also want you to notice is this building here, at times used as a carpenter shop, and also sometimes I think labeled as a blacksmith shop. Note that building because right now with this photo when it was taken, this was about at the same level. I'll point that building out to you in a later photo. Now this photograph you can see in the foreground is one of the steam shovels. So this was one of the first really heavy pieces of equipment aside from the locomotives that started being used within the mine. And of course, this did the work of many, many men. In the background, you can see these pieces here. These are steam-powered drills that drilled the iron ore in preparation for loading and explosives to again help to extract the ore. Now you remember I had said keep that building in mind. This you can see is the same building. So you can see by the time that this picture was taken in 1944, that there was quite a bit of iron ore that was taken out of the mine. So using more technology allowed for more ore to be taken out of the mine, but this created other issues as well. It became more difficult to use the locomotives because of the steep grade. So eventually hoists like the one that you see here would have skip cars, and that would be used to take ore out of the hole. But again, you know, notice these large shovels and all of these different steam drills that are being aided. So by this time, they're using a lot of equipment that took the place of all those men that we saw in the earlier photo. Now this image was taken, you can see in 1951, and it shows a side dump truck dumping ore into a pocket that has a skip at the bottom, and then that skip would then take the iron ore up and out of the pit. But you can get a very good idea from this image just exactly how steep the sides were at this time. Because of how steep things were getting and how small the bottom of the open pit was getting, because of course every time that they went down deeper, it got narrower and narrower in the open pit. So in 1921, an underground mine was begun. The idea was to dig under the open pit. And this was to be the first of 2 underground mines at Cornwall. And you can see in the photograph, this is you know, going down into the pit with a group of workers all around it when this was opened up in 1923. So these are photographs of the operation while underground. You can see in the photo to the left men that are drilling inside of this. So they're still working, you know, in much the same way that they did on the surface, oftentimes with, you know, these mechanical drills that are being used. But also they're even using small locomotives underground to take the ore out of the mines. Now, this is an image of the way that the mine looked in 1964. And at this time period, you can see that the mine has very much developed. And this is just 9 years before Cornwall would eventually close. And you can see the open pit which is right here. You can see the concentrator plant, which is here at the top of the photo. You can see the number 3 mine, which would have been in this location. Also the number 4 mine, which is up in this location. Miners Village, which is off here to the right. This used to be where Route 322 came right through this area. You can also see Cornwall Manor, the retirement community. And right here is Cornwall Iron Furnace. Now, juxtapose that last image with this one. So this is what Cornwall looked like in 1800. So, 164 years approximately between that last image and this image. So this is a drawing that actually is owned by Cornwall Manor of the property, the way that it looked in 1800. So the image of the man to the left, of course, is Robert Coleman. At the time in 1800, he was the owner of this. So you could see at the very bottom of this that says the estate of Robert Coleman, Esquire. It also shows the iron plantation, but it also has insets of the mansion, of the furnace, and also the front of the stack. You can see that there are waterways, and you can see races, mill, orchards, many, many different things that are on this. So let's look at it a little bit closer. So this is showing more of the central part of that same map. One of the things I really want to show is that this is Big Hill. So this is showing the mining operation as it stood, very early on. And notice all the roads that are being cut into the mining operation. So these are all the access points to get to the different levels, because of course, this is the top of the hill. This is more the bottom of the hill. So they have all these different access points to come in. And also you can see, its location to the furnace, how close that is, but also this was the ironmaster's home that was here, which today is the Buckingham Mansion on the property at Cornwall Manor. What's also great about this image is that it gives us 2 different depictions of the furnace itself at that time. You can see the charcoal house, the connecting shed, the charging house. This stepped piece is the furnace stack, the casting house, and this roofed area, which would have been over the water wheel. You can also see that this sluice is what is conveying the water from its water source over to the water wheel. And you can even see these piles and things, as well as this. That's the slag, all the waste product that's coming out of the furnace. So that's a really great depiction of what the furnace looked like, at this period. So this is really what a furnace of that time period would have looked like, especially one that has water-powered works. So charcoal, iron ore, and limestone are fed into the top of the furnace stack. The water wheel, that provided power to run the large bellows, which you can see here, and that provided the blasts of air. Both slag and molten iron were tapped from the furnace every 12 hours in the casting room. So that's what we have, the slag and the molten iron. Cornwall produced about 3 tons of iron a day. The operation was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for about 10 months out of the year. So again, this is how Cornwall Iron Furnace looks like today. So this is very different from the drawing. Quite a bit has changed in that time period. So the building that we have on site today largely dates to the mid to late 1850s, when the Gothic Revival style of architecture was popular. This is the most complete cold blast iron furnace in North America. Again, that's the significance of the site. You can see that I have labeled, the casting house, which is kind of here in the foreground, the furnace stack that's here, and this extension that's here, about this much of it is where all of the blast apparatus, that's what's making the air. And we'll talk a little bit more about that soon. So this is an image of the furnace from another side. This is the side that actually faces Cornwall Manor, which of course was the ironmaster's mansion. Note the casting house, which is down here to the right, the furnace stack, which is somewhat hidden. You can then see the charging house as well as the connecting shed. The connecting shed was important because it kept the fuel, which was charcoal, dry during its transport into the furnace. So this image is a front and rear view of the charcoal barn. The furnace burned about 1 acre of forest per day, and that had to be, of course, made into charcoal. The charcoal barn held about 100 days worth of fuel. This building was built into a bank so that charcoal could be loaded into the building at 2 levels and even through the roof. So on the front level, you can see where these arched openings are. This is on the rear where these pieces of wood, that's where the upper openings would be to dump charcoal at a higher level. And then these ladders went up to areas that had these copper covers. Those would be removed, and then baskets of charcoal would be loaded into the building. So this is an image of the inside of the charging room. So this would have been immediately adjacent to that connecting shed. So it acted as a bridge between the natural bank and the top of the 32-foot high furnace stack. It kept charcoal, iron ore, and limestone dry. And also, very importantly, it kept water out of the stack. So the ingredients would have been dumped and placed near the charging hole and then pushed into it from a distance. The cutaway on the left, so this piece over here, shows the layers of material that went into the stack. Charging happened about once an hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for about 10 months out of the year. Furnaces typically close down in January and February for maintenance like relining the stack. So these were put in, you can see that charcoal typically was put in first, then with iron ore on top of it, limestone on top of that. The charcoal obviously is the fuel. The iron ore is what we are melting or smelting. The limestone acting as a flux. So this image is of the blowing tubs, and those are the barrel-like structures that you see. So this is inside of the building and part of the blast apparatus. So we needed air to go into the furnace to make the charcoal burn hot enough, which is somewhere between about 26 and 2800 degrees, to smelt or melt the iron ore. This blast apparatus that is here is a very rare survivor. And again, one of the things that makes Cornwall as significant as it is. So the air from those blowing tubs came in to near the furnace through this large pipe at the top of the photo. And then it went into 3 other pipes that took air in the 3 different sides of the furnace. The box that you see right here allowed for the diversion of air during casting. So when they were casting, they didn't want air to go in to where the iron was being made. But at the same time, they didn't want to turn everything off. So just by opening the top lid of this box, the air would just kind of harmlessly go into the room. So this is a photo of the Great Wheel. So most of the people that come to Cornwall, this is one of the things that's just very iconic inside of the building. So it weighs 4 tons. is 24 feet across and in some ways acts as a flywheel in a way to transfer motion. It sits directly below the blowing tubs, and the rods at the end of the wheel's axle go up and down and creates the motion inside the blowing tubs to move and create the air for the blast. And this is very much like a bicycle pump operates. Now, originally, Cornwall used water power to create its air. By the early 1840s, steam power was used to augment the water power. And by the 1850s, the power came entirely from steam. And in 1859, the present 20 horsepower engine was installed. The boilers for the engine are on top of the stack and utilize the waste heat from the furnace. Steam is then transferred to the engine and does the work. So this is the furnace stack as viewed from the casting room. So here is where the slag was drawn from the furnace and cast iron items were made. The furnace typically was tapped twice a day, resulting in 3,000 pounds of cast iron per pour. The room has a sand floor for casting and a high ceiling to direct as much heat upward and out of the building as possible. There are records in England where they'd say that when the iron was being poured, that temperatures in the room would exceed over 150 degrees, so that getting rid of that intense heat was something that was built into the design of this casting room. So we don't have any images of them casting at Cornwall, but this is an engraving from the 1780s of the Coalbrookdale furnace in Shropshire, England. So this is showing an evening pour where the men are actually being illuminated by the glowing molten iron. So the guttermen, so these guys here, you can see they all have long iron handled pieces, are moving the iron along the gutter and into the molds in the casting floor. They are making cast iron ingots known as pigs. So that's what these glowing pieces are. So this is the gutter, the molten metal coming out of the furnace stack, which is here, going along the gutter, and they're working it to make it go into these molds that were just in the sand floor that they're casting the pigs. So we're going to talk a little bit about products that were actually made or cast here at the furnace. So this is a photo of workers from about 1900, and the men you can see are stacking pigs that were made at the Robisonia furnace. So Robisonia had miners at Cornwall and used Cornwall ore to make their iron. Note how the men are dressed. They have aprons and leather pads on to protect their hands. The pigs were rough because of being cast in rough sand. Pigs, of course, were one of the products made at Cornwall. So this is a page from the 1770 blast books, and this shows a tonnage of pigs made by a man who worked here at the furnace named David Short. On May 10th of 1770, David was credited for making 21 tons of pigs in about a 6 or 7 day time period. So the pigs actually required further refining. That was not a finished product unto itself, and it needed that to be able to be made useful. So this is an illustration of a water-powered forge. A forge transformed cast iron into wrought iron. Now, part of the Cornwall operation included Hopewell Forge, which was located near Route 322 west of Brickerville, near the Hammer Creek. So in the 1765 to 1767 account book of Hopewell and Cornwall, you could see the sale of bar iron, and you can see right here, this is February of 1766, all this bar iron, you can see it written right here, was sold. And you can see they're selling it really by the pound, and this is being done in an Old English style. So this is hundredweight, quarter hundredweight, and then just the pounds. And you can see then what they're charging over here. So in all, this was 15 pounds, 8 shillings, 9 pence worth of bar iron that they sold that day. So stoves were another item made at Cornwall in the 1700s. The photos show an early style of stove favored by the Pennsylvania Germans that we refer to as a 5-plate or a jam stove. It was made of 5 iron plates. You can see how it was used by the illustration to the right. So these were built into the back of usually kitchen fireplaces, and they had 5 plates of iron. That's where it gets its name. So it's lacking a rear plate. So the area that you see here is E is open in the stone wall so that you could load wood into the box essentially. And then smoke would actually go out this flue into the common flue here. So if you've been into Ephrata, you would see some of these, I believe, in some of the buildings and also masonry or tile stoves. They're all using a very similar technology, but that's one of the early things that was made at a lot of the iron furnaces in southeastern Pennsylvania. Now, the photo that's there to the left is of the only known intact iron 5-plate stove, and it's not even in Pennsylvania. The casting wasn't from Pennsylvania, but this is actually in a historic house in Frederick, Maryland called Schifferstadt. And again, the plates or the stove was made here in Pennsylvania, but not at Cornwall. However, these stove plates were made at Cornwall in 1752, and this is when the furnace was leased out to a group of investors. One of the investors, or at least one of the later investors, and person who was running the furnace at the time was a man by the name of Amos Garrett. If you look up here in the upper left of this plate, you can see the name of Amos Garrett cast right into the plate, and you can see the 1752 date. So this is a side plate, and this is a front plate of the stove. So you would have needed another side plate that would have been somewhat a mirror image of this one, and a top and a bottom plate, and those would have been your 5 plates for the stove. So this is another stove plate that was made at Cornwall. The previous ones are in our collection, so is this one. These are on display here at the museum. In 1765, the furnace returned to the Grubb family after the ending of a 20-year lease. And that's that group of investors I was talking about before. So during the lease, Peter Grubb, who founded the furnace, died. So 1754, he dies. His sons, Peter and Curtis Grubb, took over the operation when it was returned in 1765. So this plate, which has Curtis Grubb's name on, you can see right here, Curtis Grubb. We think it stands for Curtis Grubb Furnace. Dates of sometime between 1765 and about 1775. While most of the iron made at Cornwall was made into pigs, there are many other things that were made here. So to the left, so right here, is a page from the 1773 blast book. And there are some of the things that were made here. So you can see that they're making a small 10-plate stove, a large 10-plate stove, a 6-plate stove, and then they're giving values. So a 5-pound stove, so not weight 5 pounds, but the monetary unit of pound. So a 5-pound plate stove, a 4-pound plate stove, a 3-pound plate stove. They're also making fuller's plates, fire backs, window weights, forge plates, bits, braces, grate bars, griddles, and still bars. So in some of our other blast books of 1769 as well as 1771, there are other items including pots, half-price pots, not sure what that is, but they were literally half the price of a regular pot, as well as kettles anvils, flat irons, Franklin stoves, mortars, bells, still yard peas. A still yard was something that was a steel yard, which was a balance scale. And a pea is a size of one of the weights. So I think those are referring to the weights from a steel yard or steel yard. Handware, which I'm not really sure what it is, but in all the books they have handware that's there. Pot cheeks, same thing, not exactly sure what that is. And sows, which are the center casts of when making pigs. So here you can see a full entry from the 1770 blast book, which I want you to draw your attention to here. So you can see there where it says forge plates. You can see here that someone had purchased 3 forge plates. And if you look here, it gives who actually purchased it, which was a man by the name of Henry William Stegall. So Stegall owned Elizabeth Furnace at Brickerville, but he's buying forge plates. So he did have a forge, but this was in in Womelsdorf, and known as Charming Forge. So it looks like in 1773, Stegall was buying forge plates for Charming Forge in Womelsdorf. So in this entry, you can actually see that where I have the arrows, that they're casting Franklin stoves. So, and this is a fairly rare item that was cast at Cornwall. And the 1773 blast book shows 2 of them being cast in December. And if you look, they're in that 5-pound category, which appears to be fairly expensive. And you can see by the engraving on the right, which is of a Franklin stove, which is more of an insert than a kind of a true stove. They're fairly elaborate and took a fair number of plates to cast. So that would have had to do with why it was so expensive. So there were other specialty items that were cast at Cornwall during the early period of the American Revolution. At that time, Cornwall produced 42 naval guns, 722 10-inch shells, 162 8-inch shells, 2,700 24-pound shot, 2,762 18-pound shot, and 6,566 12-pound shot. So quite a bit of munitions. But this was not part of the skill set of the local molders. So an expert was brought in to direct the process, and cannon molds were also brought in to the furnace from Philadelphia. They also had to set up boring equipment that was helped to produce to true the barrels of the cannon. Each of the cannon had to be test fired twice to proof, so in order to go ahead and be put into service. It's from these test fires that the cannonballs were recovered by antiquarians and are now on display with the cannon at the museum. So this cannon that we're showing in the upper left was actually cast here at Cornwall, but it didn't cast correctly. So it was actually never drilled, so that we know that they didn't even try to test fire it. However, the cannonballs that are there were all recovered from a meadow that's across the street from the museum. So these were things that were fired to test and proof the cannons that were cast here. So I also wanted to touch a little bit about tonight about the workers that were here at Cornwall. And that type of worker that was here, you could see changed over time. So in the 1700s, you could see that many of the workers were of English, Irish, or of German background. There also was a fairly large population of enslaved Africans that were part of the workforce. At times, almost made up about 1/3 of the workforce at Cornwall. They also used indentured servants, and during the American Revolution, they also used prisoner of wars, what we commonly call the Hessians. So that's really what our workforce looked like in the 1700s. In the 1800s, it's much the same type of people with the exception of the indentured servants and the prisoners of war. But a lot of it now came from really the local population and really the progeny of workers that were before. So when we look into the 1800s, we actually see a lot of the same last names that we see in some of the record books from the 1700s. So you have really generations of people that then are working at Cornwall, in some instances passing on the same job from father to son. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, those workers, that started to change again. You started to see a lot more of Southern and Eastern Europeans enter the workforce. You saw African Americans from the South. Even in the 1930s, there were a fair number of Spanish-speaking Mexicans who start to come into the workforce. And of course, particularly as the underground mining develops, they needed that expertise to come in. So you start to see miners come in from other areas, some of it from other states, some of it are just miners coming in from the coal regions in like Schuylkill County, just north of Lebanon County. So we're going to look at some of the 1700s or the 18th century workforce, and we're going to use one of our books. It's just simply called the Cordwood book, and you can see that this dates from 1768 and 1769. So here's a page. This page shows wood that was cut from March through October of 1769 at Happus Swamp. Most likely this is on land not owned by the Grubbs, and thus that's why they're accounting for it in this way. So all of this wood was made into charcoal by this man by the name of John Green. Another interesting piece on here is this man, a man by the name of William Johnson, who's an indentured servant who cut 52 cords of wood. It's interesting because you can see that he did not have an amount entered on his behalf like many of the other entries. So if you see an entry like this, it says entered to his credit on the 25th of March, 1769. You'll see there's nothing after this. So he is not getting credited for this. All the rest of these people, or I should say most of the rest of them, are actually doing somewhat piecework where they're getting paid by the cord. He, of course, is not getting paid because he's an indentured servant. You'll also see some other names. You'll see that here on September 9th, there is a piece that says Negroes. Here on October 2nd, here's a second one that says Negroes. And if you look between those two listings, that's 201 cords of wood that's cut. And just like William Johnson, there's nothing afterwards. So more than likely, almost assuredly, these Negroes were enslaved, enslaved labor that was working here at Cornwall. Now, there's another very interesting entry that's here, though, right here. You can see that this says, and this would have been September 9th, Negro Scipio, and it has 2 cords of wood. But you'll see, unlike some of those others, that it also was entered to his credit on April 18th. This looks to probably be 1770. So what's the story here? So was this man free? Was he enslaved but allowed to do labor to earn some cash? It's hard to say, but this is again how the labor force is made up here at Cornwall in this period. So this is a document from Curtis Grubb's estate inventory. So when Curtis Grubb died, you can see that his estate inventory included 21 enslaved laborers, 16 of which were at Cornwall. The list gives the name, the age, and the cash value of each man, woman, and child, the youngest of whom was 4 months old. A familiar name on the list is this man right here. And you can see it says Governor Dick. and it lists him as being 58 years old, and again, 1789. So that puts him born around 1730, 1731, and he was valued at 30 pounds. So this is really where we get most of the factual information about Governor Dick. So in 1796, Dick tried to free himself, and because he was, seen as this piece of property, Rudolph Kelker, who at the time was the manager here at the furnace for Robert Coleman, put an ad in the Lancaster County newspaper. So this reads, you can see $20 reward, ran away from Cornwall Furnace, Dauphin County. At the time, it's Dauphin County. On the Sunday, 17th April last, a Negro man called Dick, alias Governor Dick. He's an elderly man, bald-headed, about 5 feet 10 inches high, stout made, has a down look, is slightly marked on each of his temples with the small scores usual to some of the natives of Africa. So in many ways, it looks like he's born in 1730-ish and possibly in Africa itself. So it says that he has large feet and a remarkable scar on the great toe of his right foot, occasioned by being split with an axe. He is by trade a rough carpenter, values himself greatly on his dexterity in that occupation, had on when he went away a new drab-colored coatee, and goes on to give his clothes. As he lived an early part of his life in Harford County, state of Maryland, it is probable that he has shaped his course for that quarter. And then, asking that whoever essentially would turn him in gets a $20 reward. So we think that Dick was successful because after these ads that were put in the newspaper in 1796, that's the last that we really see. So, if any of you are ever in the Mount Gretna area and see the name of Governor Dick or Governor Dick's Hill, this is who this was named after. So if you look at this slide, these are some different records that actually do show some of the enslaved people that were here at Cornwall. Records such as the 1798 federal direct tax, the 1800 septennial census, and the 1807 septennial census. So the enslaved laborers at times constituted as much as a third of the furnace labor force and continued to be used on the Cornwall estate as late as 1830. In the 1830 census, Thomas Coleman, who at that time was running Cornwall Iron Furnace, this is just 5 years after his father passes, is listed as having one male aged 55 to 100, two females aged 10 to 24 enslaved in his household. So that's really the last mention of enslaved people that we had here at Cornwall. So labor was always an issue at many early furnaces. And this is an ad that was put in a newspaper in 1765 by Curtis and Peter Grubb, soon after they get ownership back from that group of investors. And they're looking, you can see, for woodcutters, colliers, carters, and common laborers. One of the ways that they tried to augment the workforce, aside from having enslaved labor, was using indentured labor. And this was mainly people that were either English or Irish. You can see that from all of these ads, and these are ads from people that had run away that were indentured. They had some problems keeping that labor force. And you can see here, Cornwall Furnace, an Irish servant man, Richard Tobine, run away from the scriber last night, living at Cornwall Iron Furnace. An English servant, James Brown. Here we have another one, Robert Wallace, another Scots-Irish person. And this last one from 1785, James Rourke. So again, they had, and another Richard Pendergast. So, that's witness that they were having quite a bit of issue bringing people and keeping them as the labor force. Now, while in the 1700s, much of the labor was foreign-born, enslaved, or indentured, by 1850, few of those things were true about the Cornwall labor force. The one thing I'd like you to look at this is notice the columns that say where born. So that's these columns in these 3 census pages from the 1850. So if you look at those, almost everyone is born in Pennsylvania. And there were some that were born in Maryland and New Jersey. And there's just a few that were born, you could see, let me get this, down here in either England or Ireland. So if you look at this, the overwhelming majority of the workers are white, with the exception of the Mellon family, who's African American. So if you look up here, you can see this area here, few people that are born in Maryland, they're actually African Americans in this African American family. So on this page, or on these 3 pages, you can see a furnace owner, laborers, teamsters, a hostler, colliers, and a master miner, a man by the name of Thomas Shea. So Thomas Shea, he's listed all the way over here. So he was 69 years old and a veteran of the War of 1812 when this was taken, and is still listed as working. He and his large extended Irish American family worked at Cornwall for several generations, and his brother John Shea was a founder at Cornwall, which was one of the jobs, really the main foreman of running the furnace. And John's son was also a founder after his father. So this is one of those cases where, you know, trade secrets were being passed from father to son. Now, by 1900, the labor force changed again. As production at the mine increased and the furnaces became larger and more productive, much more labor was needed to meet the demand. So this is a photo of one of the more modern furnaces that was here at Cornwall. This was built in the 1870s, known as the Bird Coleman furnace. And this was one of the most modern operations. And unlike our charcoal furnace, this used anthracite coal. Now, in this page from the 1900 census, it shows 2 separate households by the last name of Davies that are African Americans from Virginia. The Hiram Davies family, so that's the family up top here, came to Pennsylvania before 1881, as witnessed by the birth of their daughter, Bessie. She's born in Pennsylvania in 1881, so that we know that they came before that. Now, as Hiram was born in 1856 in Virginia, he was most likely born into slavery, as was his wife, Eliza, who was born in 1859. The Davies family was part of a mass migration of African Americans who left the rural South for jobs in the industrial North, particularly after Reconstruction ended. And that's when a lot of the Jim Crow laws started to come in and started to be enforced. So many African Americans from the South started coming into the more industrial North seeking jobs. And that's something that's definitely the case here at Cornwall in the mines and the furnaces that were here by 1900. So here is another page of the 1900 census, and this shows another mass migration. This one, however, from Southern and Eastern Europe. Note the section that's marked with an arrow that asks about citizenship and migration. So this is the area that's asking about citizenship. You'll see up here, these are all native-born people, almost all of them from Pennsylvania. So there's still a fairly large native-born local population that's working here in the furnace, or furnaces and the mine. But you'll notice that's now being augmented by this entire labor force here at the bottom. So if you look at the dates on this, which I'm sure are very hard for you to see, but none of these workers or their families were in the country 10 years prior to the census. So before 1890, none of these people were in the country. And most of them are described as either being miners or laborers in a blast furnace. This is another page from the 1900 census, and this shows many recent immigrants from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, by looking at the last names, a few of them are German sounding last names. Most of them are Hungarian sounding last names. And you also see many people from Italy. If you look here at the bottom, you can see this vast amount of them all clumped together. So these are men that are single men living in a boarding house. Again, none of them are in the country before 10 years prior to this. And as single men, typically they would come over, and later on, if they had wives or families, they would establish themselves and then later send for them. And most of them in this are just classified as laborers. So they're really at the bottom of the barrel as far as the labor force here at the Cornwall Mine and also the later furnaces. So I want to talk also just a little bit about where the families work. So where did this workforce live? So these are some of the miners' houses in Miners Village. Miners and their families would live in these duplex that consisted of an attic, a basement, 2 rooms on the first floor, 2 rooms on the second floor. They had backyards that had gardens, chicken houses, and room for other small animals that they would use for food. These were built to attract, and this is directly from minutes of the mining company, to attract a better class of worker. And these they thought were people that had families. And some of these, the earliest houses that you see here on the main street of Miners Village were built in the late 1860s. Now, these photos from the 1950s, however, capture some of the earlier workers' homes. The photo on the right is of a log home that most likely dated to about the late 1700s or early 1800s. Several of these were actually depicted on that circa 1800 Cornwall map. There are little kind of households and farms all across that map, and most of those most likely were in these one-story log houses. Now, the photo on the left is of a stone duplex that by the time period of this photo, which again is the 1950s, this had been turned into a single family home. Now, this was built in the 1850s and in that same kind of Gothic revival style of the furnace. Now, the status of the worker also dictated the size of the home. This photo is of the furnace manager's home. Note how much larger it is than the last homes that I showed you that were for the common workers. This house was built around 1830 and is sometimes referred to as the Jackson House. James Jackson was the manager of Cornwall during its final 2 decades of operation, the Cornwall Iron Furnace. He lived here with clerks from the furnace as well as his sister. Later, this was the office for Bethlehem Steel. And when this photo was taken, that's what the function of this building was. This is the Bethlehem Steel office after the mine had went over to Bethlehem Steel ownership. Now, this was the home of the mine superintendent, J. Taylor Boyd. And really, one does not have to wonder about the status and the value of him to the operation. This was a very large home that was built in 1884. However, this was demolished in 1964 to make way for an expansion of the open pit of the mine. So let's go ahead and I'll do a little conclusion here for the talk. So why was Cornwall and the Pennsylvania iron industry important? So this graphic is from a Reading, Pennsylvania $10 bill, and I think this really gives us a hint. Iron helped to revolutionize the way that we live and helped to build and unite the nation. So this was an agricultural nation and it became an industrial nation. Without iron, it's hard to imagine the locomotive. Without the locomotive, it's hard to imagine the convenient shipping of other Pennsylvania staples like coal, oil, timber, and of course, agricultural products. Iron changed the way in which we developed and also changed the way in which we lived. So with that, I thank you for coming and listening to the talk. And Michael, I'd certainly entertain any questions if people have them.
Thank you so very much, Mike, for this program this evening. It's been really informative. And I neglected to mention this right at the start, but if you do have questions, please type them in the chat box and we will gather them up and share them with Mike and get your answers for you. So if there are any questions, we'd love to know about them. I'll give you just a moment to add some questions. Oh, here's the first one. Were women involved at all in the operation?
Women were involved in many different ways. One of the things that you may have noticed when I had some of the names of certainly the enslaved Africans, there are women that are amongst that. I know there's at least one case in which they are helping to do wood cutting. So we know that women were involved, in some respects in the 18th century. In the 19th century, of course, you saw those names of families. So they were part of the households that were here and operating, taking care of things. But also we had women involved at the level of ownership. When the Coleman family, after they got controlling interest of Cornwall and also the mine, as subsequent generations went on, there were several women that came into substantial ownership shares of the Cornwall iron operation. That included the mine and also several of the later furnaces. It was a woman by the name of Margaret Coleman Freeman Buckingham who actually donated this to the Commonwealth. She was able to donate it because she was an exceedingly wealthy woman who had the Ashburton House, which was this major house that was in Washington, D.C. That was her winter home, spring and fall here at Cornwall, and summers in Bar Harbor. Not a bad life. And she, had ownership shares of different things, as did her mother, as did aunts. So women were involved here, not only from the standpoint they were cutting wood, but they were also involved in the ownership of the mine and the furnace operations.
Another question asks, did the brothers and sisters at Ephrata use Cornwall iron?
The assumption would be yes, because this was going to be one of the closest areas in which iron is going to be produced. Probably not as cast items. I've seen some of your iron stoves that were down there. I don't think any of the plates are from Cornwall. But knowing the amount of iron that came out of ground during archaeology, I'm assuming a lot of the wrought iron would have been produced here, taken down to Hopewell Forge, pounded into wrought iron, and then taken down to places where blacksmiths in the Cocalico area were using it.
And if I may just add, also Elizabeth Furnace probably was a source for a lot of cast products.
Right.
We do have in our collection, although the origin of it is not necessarily the property itself. It's there now. We think it may have come from there, but there's sort of a missing link in the chain. A stove plate from Elizabeth Furnace.
Those seem to be far more common in this area. I've seen many Elizabeth Furnace plates around. Cornwall Furnace plates seem to be far rarer. And we do have the production records. They were being made in some fairly large numbers. But we also think that particularly in the earliest time period, because of the southern orientation of ownership, or at least of the lease, people from Maryland, that a lot of that iron possibly was going south. So, there may have been a fair number of stoveplates in Maryland or Virginia instead of those that, were going further eastward.
The question is, what sort of mold was used to produce the pigs?
Now, in our collection, we actually have wooden patterns that were used as molds for that. Now, in the earliest days, I think what they were using was something that looked more like a hoe that they could go ahead and just make a ditch in the sand. But I think if you wanted them to be fairly regular, by using that pattern, each one was going to be, pretty close to the size of the next. So, I think they were using both of those here at Cornwall.
This question, I'll answer this one. Will this recording be available to view in the future? Yes, it will. But as I mentioned as we started, we seem to be having some technical glitches in getting these recordings mounted onto the website. So give us several days, even a week, before we can get this up. But we do hope to have this back up for you to view, and that can be accessed through our website.
Michael, I have a question for Mike.
Yes.
There must have been, with the charcoal, there must have been such huge amounts that were needed. The area immediately surrounding the furnace and the hills and the mountains close by must have been denuded really quickly. Like, what did they have to do to supply that kind of wood for charcoal?
That's a great question, Nick, because again, they're using about an acre a day in the furnace. They're going to be in blast approximately 300 days out of the year. So, it only takes a little over 3 years to take away, 1,000 acres of wood. So, even the acreage that was here, which was substantial, this was about a 10,000 acre property. It wouldn't have taken that long. So some of those earliest cordwood books are actually giving the names of other people. So what we think at certain times, particularly when farmers were developing farms, that they were selling wood to help clear land that then was being made into charcoal and brought to the furnace. So, in the time period that we operated, I'm sure that the 10,000 acres probably had been cut and coaled several times over the life of the forest. But when the railroads came in, so did the opportunity to bring in charcoal from other locations. So it looks like in later time period, they're actually bringing it in from other places. But yes, that was going to be kind of the Achilles heel of a lot of these charcoal iron furnaces, was just the natural resources. Many of them were built near iron sources that weren't that great. So they would play out in a few decades. Well, that wasn't the issue here. This was an iron source that, at least in the 18th century, seemed all but, inexhaustible. And I'm sure when they first came here and looked at the amount of wood, that would have also seemed inexhaustible. However, it was not, and would have been an issue.
Thank you.
Mike, are you familiar with Alden's appeal and the sort of the conclusions from Alden? You need 10,000, 5,000 acres just isn't going to cut it, which is what happened to Elizabeth.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like a lot of land until you're cutting that much off every year. And yes, I see in the comments, Mike Weber made it a very good thing. When I wrote down in my notes the amount of iron ore that came out of the pit, it was 106 million, not 160 million. So I was off by 54 million in the talk. So I'm sorry about that.
Are there other comments or questions? I'm not seeing them from where I am, but
There are none.
Okay.
In the chat box.
All right. Yeah, I don't see it either. All right. Well, thank you. Well, thank you, everyone, for being with us this evening. Thank you especially to Mike Emery from Cornwall Iron Furnace and sharing this really important part of American history. Furnaces such as Cornwall were dotted throughout the landscape of early America and into the 20th century, not using charcoal in the 20th century, but the furnaces really, as Mike said, provided a really backbone to the industrial development of America. And we thank you very much, Mike, for sharing all this information with us this evening. We are going to stop the recording. We will do our best to get this recording onto our website. Give us, several days to a week